Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last Embedded Racism in the Law panel event of the spring semester. My name is Laurie Beyranevand. I'm a professor at Vermont Law School and the director of the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems, which is hosting tonight's event focused on embedded racism in the law and policy affecting farm workers. The Center for Agriculture and Food Systems is housed within Vermont Law School's Environmental Law Center, and today is an important day for our community and the world. As many of you know, it's Earth Day. Tonight's panel focuses on a group that is in many ways on the front lines of climate justice. Farm workers are feeling the effects of climate change firsthand. They're disproportionately affected by heat-related illness, the increasing use of pesticides, and by extreme weather events like wildfires and drought. Vermont is not immune to these concerns. Many of the farm workers in our state are living under inhumane conditions, working extraordinary amounts of hours, earning below the minimum wage, and suffering retaliation for voicing concerns. On this day, as we honor the earth, we must also honor those who steward it and consider how we protect their health and safety alongside our planet. Before we get started, I wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items. If you're joining via Zoom, feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box. If you're joining on the Vermont Law School live stream, please feel free to put your questions in the comment box. We'll monitor both and hope to get to as many of your questions as we can. We're also recording the webinar this evening. If you registered through Zoom or Eventbrite, we'll send you a link to the recording after the event. If you're joining through the Vermont Law School live stream, you can find a link to the recording afterwards. If you're interested in watching or sharing a version of this event with Spanish subtitles, please email us at caps@vermontlaw.edu. We hope to create a Spanish subtitle version if there's interest. And now on to the people you're here to see. We're honored to have three amazing panelists joining us tonight to share with us their knowledge and expertise. Figueroa is the Director of Economic and Environmental Justice at Farmworker Justice. Ms. Figueroa has been working with Farmworker Justice since 2016. She engages in advocacy and community education for farm workers on issues related to occupational health and safety, labor rights, and immigration. She meets regularly with farm workers, serving organizations around the country to discuss developments on the ground, as well as updates in federal policy that affect the farm worker community. She's a native Spanish speaker and received her BS from Georgetown, her JD from Columbia Law School, and an LLM from the University of Amsterdam. She's admitted to practice law in New York and in the District of Columbia. Next, we have Abel Luna, who grew up as a farm worker, working since he was 13. He worked with the Rural Migrant Ministry in New York as an organizer fighting with farm workers and allies to win groundbreaking legislative improvements for agricultural workers, including improving minimum wage laws. He is now an organizer at Migrant Justice, an organization based in Burlington, Vermont, and that was founded and led by farm workers. Since 2009, Migrant Justice has led a number of groundbreaking campaigns for human rights and economic justice, including Milk with Dignity, a worker-driven program to ensure human rights for farm workers in the dairy industry. Finally, we have Professor Juan Perea. Those of you who joined us for our last Embedded Racism panel last fall might remember that one of our panelists, Sherry White Williamson, recommended a book during that event entitled Race and Races, Cases and Resources for a Diverse America. Professor Perea is the author of that book. He is the Curt and Linda Rodin Professor of Law and Social Justice and an Associate Dean for Research and Faculty at Loyola University Chicago School of Law. He's a nationally recognized scholar who focuses on the central role of race in constitutional law, legal history, and immigration history, and has written extensively on racial inequity, the legal history of race relations in the United States, and the civil rights of Latinos. We'll start tonight's panel with Professor Juan Perea, who will discuss the racist origins of exclusions in the law pertaining to farm workers. And Juan, I'll pass it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Laurie. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today, and thank you for everybody who's tuning in. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the early origins of farm labor and the treatment of farm labor in the US, which involves looking at the Constitution and its treatment of slavery. The current status of farm workers, sadly, is not far from slavery as it was known in the 19th century. And there are reasons for this. The notion of a segmented workforce, segmented by race and class, goes back to the founding of the country. And so what I want to show you, I have a PowerPoint presentation to share with you. I want to show you how deeply embedded the protection of slavery was in the Constitution. And I think that's the proper framework for understanding how deeply embedded racism is generally, why racist patterns of policing and wealth distribution and education, why all of this continues to exist. It really goes back to the commitments made at the founding. So let me begin with that, and I hope you won't think it's too far afield, but most people don't realize this, and I think it's necessary context. So actually, let me see. I think I probably need to share screen first. Let's see, we'll get this right. We'll share screen first, and then I'm hoping for my presentation to come up in a second. All right, just 1 second. And we're going to do slideshow. Okay. Okay, so my hope is that you're looking at a PowerPoint slide that says embedded racism on the farm. Can somebody confirm that that's okay? Excellent. I love it when things work. Sadly, it's not every time, but here we are. Good. Okay, so why is that not going? Okay, here we go. So this is a description from one fairly recent history of the Constitution that concludes that the Constitution itself was pro-slavery, meaning that it both protected and promoted slave ownership. This is the conclusion that most historians reach about the Constitution. And it's really interesting that for the most part in law school, we don't teach the Constitution as a pro-slavery instrument, but it pretty clearly is, and I'm going to show you the ways in which it is pro-slavery. So this is the Apportionment Clause, and you see that at the end, the reference to 3/5 of all other persons. This is a reference to slaves, and what it does is it counts 3/5 of the number of slaves owned towards the number of representatives in the federal Congress among the slave states. So the number of representatives was boosted by 3/5 the number of slaves to increase the representation of slave states. This is the slave import limitation, which limits the ability of Congress to regulate the international slave trade. And it guarantees the continuance of the slave trade at least for 21 years. Sometimes this is misinterpreted because it's just the ability of Congress to regulate the international slave trade. It has nothing to do with the domestic slave trade, and there was no will to interfere or regulate the domestic slave trade. This is the Fugitive Slave Clause, and it's often poignant for me to look at it because it creates a national right on the part of slave owners to recapture escaped slaves, and that there was no national right before the Constitution. After the Constitution, every slave owner had a national protected right in the Constitution to recapture escaped slaves. Notice that the places in the Constitution that actually describe slaves, here it's persons held to labor in one state, never says slavery. So, and part of that was so that it would be perceived as more neutral than it was. It's very intentional. But notwithstanding, this preserves a slave owner's right to recapture escaped slaves. And also, interestingly, I realized this recently, this is the first right. This is the only right, personal right, that's actually described in the original Constitution. And this is enacted 2 years or so before the Bill of Rights itself. So the very first right was the right of slave owners to recapture escaped slaves. This is the guarantee clause. And it says the United States shall guarantee every state a Republican form of government, but also protection against domestic violence. And what this did was to create a right of states to ask for federal troops to quell domestic violence. Domestic violence at this time is a euphemism for slave revolts. So basically it created the right of southern states to draw upon northern states and northern troops to quell slave revolts. Oh, I guess it, sorry, it backed up a little bit. I'm sure I did something to produce that. This is Article 5, part of Article 5, which is the amendment process. And in this statement, the Constitution says not only is the right to import slaves guaranteed for 21 years, but also that no amendment can be made which would change that amount of time. So this is like 2 layers of protection. Not only can Congress not authorize to regulate the slave trade for 21 years, but also the country can't amend the Constitution to change that 21-year period. It's pretty remarkable protection. The Electoral College was created also to protect the rights of slave owners, or protect the power of slave owners. This is done by reference. So we've seen before the Apportionment Clause. This is the Apportionment Clause on the top. This is the process for appointing electors for the Electoral College. And notice that the number of electors equals the number of representatives plus senators to which a state's entitled. So because the number of representatives is boosted by 3/5 of all of the persons, 3/5 of slave persons in the House, that's incorporated by reference and boosts the number of electors that correspond to the slave states. And this was done purposely to increase the representation of slave states relative to the presidential election in the same way that their representation was boosted in the House of Representatives. That, by the way, is the only reason we have an electoral college. If you ask yourself, why do we have this cumbersome mechanism that turns out to be anti-democratic? It's a direct vestige of slavery protection. And this is Madison describing it. And basically what he explains here is that fair elections or balanced elections balanced by population would not work because there were many fewer free persons in the South than in the North. So that's why an electoral college was necessary, to create more voting power among the smaller number of free persons in the South. This is Madison beginning his defense of the Apportionment Clause in the Federalist Papers. This is Madison defending all of those pro-slavery provisions in the ratifying convention in Virginia. And so he's pointing out the protection for the slave trade, protection for fugitive slaves. And interestingly, this is General Pinckney in South Carolina. He was the most fervent advocate of slavery in the Constitutional Convention. He's arguing exactly the same things. He's arguing exactly the same things in the same order, pretty much. We have unlimited importation for 20 years, and then there's the fugitive slave protection. So it's telling, I think, that both Madison and Pinckney make the same arguments to defend the protections for slavery in the Constitution. And so Pinckney was a slave owner, and South Carolina was, and so was Madison, actually. But South Carolina was the state that was most interested in importing slaves. Virginia had plenty of slaves. South Carolina didn't. And so the fact that somebody like Pinckney supports the Constitution in the end, that alone tells us it was pro-slavery, because the slave states never would have joined except for the protections for slavery. Why does this matter? It matters because the Constitution creates the structure of our government, and it creates a kind of social structure too, in which people who did agricultural labor, like slaves, were defined to be at the bottom of the political spectrum, and slavery was also defined by race. So it defined a social structure according to race, such that dark skin meant you were at the bottom. And this is produced in the Constitution itself, and then gets reproduced outside. It's very important that that's part of our founding law, because it helps us understand why there's so much inequality now based on race. Conquest matters too, and there's an important relationship between the dispossession of Indian lands which then were used to promote the growth of slavery. So there's a real intertwined history of extracting labor from slaves by force and extracting land by force from Indians. And they both work together to create a white supremacist country. So I mentioned before that this creates a kind of structure for race and for understanding race. And one of the other points that I think are important is that it doesn't begin with the Constitution, but the Constitution is a really good example that you can use entirely race-neutral language and produce very specific racially targeted harm. So you see in the Constitution, there's no reference to slavery, but there are all kinds of euphemisms that clearly describe slavery. And then we see the people supporting the Constitution being very open in arguing on its behalf that it was all about slavery. There's another theme too, which is the consistent sacrifice of equality rights of Blacks for the sake of political union among whites. This becomes important in looking at the New Deal era statutes, like the one that denies organizing rights, national organizing rights to farm workers. But it's, again, an important way of understanding how the society works. The Constitution itself is an example of this, protecting slavery for the sake of coalition among Northern and Southern whites. So we fast forward to the New Deal, and you probably know the basic story that President Roosevelt wanted to try and get the economy out of the Depression, and so tried to have enacted numerous important statutes. These are national level statutes. Some of these are still with us. Remarkably, all of them excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which only makes sense as a result of Southern desire to preserve African Americans at the bottom of the economic and social structure. All of these were intended to supplement purchasing power and give people basic economic ability to participate in the economy, to help bring the economy out of the Depression. All of them exclude agricultural and domestic workers, which at first didn't make sense. Why, if you have statutes that are intended to help everybody, why would you leave out the most vulnerable employees that we have, agricultural and domestic workers? And the answer is because most Blacks were agricultural and domestic workers. And Southerners did not want Blacks getting any kind of purchasing power or possible independence from the kind of control that that former slave owners, and now generations later, plantation owners and larger scale farmers, they had the control at that point, and they didn't want to relinquish any of it. So So this is the provision that exists, that still exists, by the way. So if you look at the National Labor Relations Act, it says employee, it'll apply to any employee except people employed as agricultural laborers or people in domestic service. Now you look at this, it doesn't say race. And unless you did a lot of research, you would have no idea that this was done for the purpose of excluding African Americans and denying them the ability to organize collectively. But that's what it was. And similarly, I mean, again, all of the statutes did that, including the Social Security Act. Most of them have been amended to be more inclusive. These are two of the remaining provisions. In the Labor Standards Act, there's an exclusion that excludes agricultural and domestic workers from maximum hours, meaning they don't get paid overtime, even if they work overtime. Again, this is a direct result of race discrimination in order to deprive African American agricultural and domestic workers of possibilities for income and self-support. So the demographics of the farm worker population are different now than they were during the New Deal era. Now it's predominantly Latino, mostly Mexican. These are very recent statistics. I'm surprised that this number of white farm workers is as high as it is. I'm just a little suspicious of that number, but it may be true. This is what my source gave me. So whereas before it used to be majority Black, although not so in the Southwest, now it's majority Latinx. And those are some sources if you want to learn more about that. So I guess, to conclude, the fact that it's now Latino workers, I mean, part of the reason for that is that African Americans migrated away from the agricultural South to a very large degree. And then large agriculturalists still needed labor to work their farms. And so they imported Latinos. But the structure is just unmistakable. And more than anything, it resembles the slave economy that used to exist for the same reasons that slavery used to exist, to allow the exploitation of persons of color who are the most vulnerable. So I'd be happy to answer any questions if I'm sure there are, or comments, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. Next, we're going to hear from Iris about some of the work that she does with Farmworker Justice, focused on litigation and policy, and a little bit about how to advocate for farm workers in light of all of these exclusions in the law.
Thank you so much, Laurie. As Laurie said, I work for Farmworker Justice, which is a national advocacy organization that works to improve farm workers' living and working conditions. So we work on issues ranging from immigration to labor rights, occupational health and safety, and access to health as well. And so I'll be talking briefly about each of these issues in turn. We also have partnerships, as was mentioned, with farm worker serving organizations on the ground across the country, whether it's farm worker unions, legal services organizations, migrant health centers, and others. And we often prepare materials on what is happening at the federal level, fact sheets on proposed bills, for example. And we also have a team dedicated to health issues among farm workers, including training and educational materials in multiple languages for workers. So I'm mentioning all of that because I want to put in a plug for our website. You can see the address right there. So if you're interested in any of these proposals, we also have an interactive 50-state map that summarizes some of the state laws on some of these issues, because as I'm sure we'll discuss further, there's a lot of differences from state to state on some of these issues. As I begin, I do want to take a moment just to acknowledge the moment in time in which we're having this conversation. It has been an incredibly hard year for so many people, but particularly for farm workers with the COVID crisis. It's really laid bare a lot of the issues and exacerbated a lot of the longstanding challenges that farm workers were facing, which of course existed pre-COVID, but just from some of the data that we have, there's estimates of about or more than 150,000 farm workers having contracted the virus. And that's likely an undercount in terms of the gaps and the challenges with testing, et cetera. And so that has really deepened economic insecurity, food insecurity, which ironically is something that many farm workers face, as well as, of course, the health outcomes from that. And so, of course, that vulnerability and those impacts are not a coincidence, right? So as Professor Perea was detailing, this is all part of the legacy of that history of exclusions of these workers. So one of the main factors and one of the main issues that we work on is immigration. And immigration is really central to any discussion about farm workers in this country for the very simple fact that the majority of farm workers are immigrants. So I'm gonna be citing some data throughout, and what we normally use to sort of get a sense of farm workers is that something called the National Agricultural Worker Survey, which is a report that the Department of Labor puts out. And so according to some of that data, the majority of agricultural workers, for about 3/4, are foreign born, most of them from Mexico. And then we have different estimates about what proportion of farm workers are undocumented. But it's probably somewhere between half to up to 70%. And it might vary again, depending on the state or the specific industry as well. What we also see across the board is that many farm workers have been in the country for a very long time. So according to that data, more than 90% have been in the US for at least 5 years, and more than half for more than 15 years. So many of them have families here in the US, including US citizen children. And the reality that they're facing, as well as other undocumented workers in the country, is that constant fear of being detained, being separated from their families. But apart from the direct threat of immigration enforcement, this is also a huge obstacle and a huge hindrance for them to speak up when there's other safety and health or labor rights issues, because that possibility of not just retaliation and consequences for themselves, but even for workers who might have immigration status, possible consequences for their family members or their co-workers as well. Our organization also does a lot of work around a specific group within the farm worker population that has been growing exponentially within the last decade. And those are what are called H2a visa workers. The H2a program is a temporary work program where foreign workers come to the US to do agricultural work. And last fiscal year, just to give you a sense of the scope, there were more than 250,000 positions certified under the program. And for those who may not be as familiar with the program, the workers are here on temporary visas, and their visas are tied to their employer. So of course, that creates a great power imbalance between employers and workers. Of course, the other major factor that workers face, as Professor Perea was detailing, are the many explicit, right, not just implicit, but very stark exclusions from this workforce, from some of the most basic protections that workers in other types of workers have, such as initially the minimum wage, although that was remedied for some workers, not all, overtime pay, and the right to unionize. And so the fact that the majority of farm workers in the country do not have the right to overtime pay, something as basic and straightforward as overtime pay, is pretty astounding, given that most farm workers work more than 40-hour work weeks. And so the fact that we still have this exclusion almost a century later has some real economic impacts, real life economic impacts on workers. Most farm workers report earning somewhere between $17,000 and $20,000 a year. And at the same time, when they're reporting their average hours, it's somewhere around 50 to 55 hours. And we know in some industries like dairy, that actually may be even higher. And so think about the economic loss of some of those hours that could be paid at time and a half for workers. But it's not just an issue of economic loss. It also has non-economic effects. Part of sort of the philosophy behind overtime protections were not just adequate compensation for workers, but also having a disincentive for employers to impose excessive work hours, and what the work hours in turn mean for workers' health and safety, and of course, all other aspects of their life. I also want to touch upon occupational health and safety. As Laurie mentioned at the beginning, farm workers are really sort of at the forefront of the impacts of climate change, whether it be natural disasters, working through wildfires while other people are taking shelter, the increasing temperatures that we're facing. So given that it's Earth Day, it's particularly fitting to talk about heat stress particularly, and a federal bill that was recently reintroduced to call for a federal OSHA standard. So this is another area where we see a lack of action on the federal level that's really long overdue. And we have a very real threat, an increasing threat with rising temperatures, but also a threat that can be managed with very basic things: water, shade, rest breaks. And so we are really calling on OSHA, on Congress, to push OSHA, but also OSHA to act on its own accord as it can to protect workers from this threat, which does not just affect farm workers, but obviously has a particular impact on farm workers. And another area that Laurie mentioned, of course, is pesticide exposure. Because of the nature of their work, not just farm workers, but also their families, because of the areas and the communities in which they live, have much higher rates of pesticide exposure. And this is yet another example of agricultural exceptionalism in regulation. So for most workers, when it comes to hazardous chemicals that they might be exposed to at work, the agency that sort of has jurisdiction over that is the Department of Labor through OSHA, through the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. But when it comes to pesticides, it's actually the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that is charged with the registration and safety rules around pesticides. And so their mandate is really to protect the environment, which is obviously a very important mandate, but is a very different mandate than protecting workers. And so it's almost an afterthought to the environment to think about the safety and health of the human beings that are applying and near the chemicals that also can cause harm to the environment. And so there's been a lot of advocacy on that front with EPA, some changes and improvements to some of the federal standards for worker safety that we have been working on along with many other advocates for many years and decades. And this is also an area where there's ongoing litigation. During the past administration, there were some attempts to roll back or reduce some of those protections. And so just to mention an example, there's something called the application exclusion zone, which is a buffer zone for where pesticides are applied. And so there were some attempts to roll back the size of that zone and the applicability of that zone in a way that would have meant possibly more exposure for farm workers and their families. And so that's one ongoing case that we hope will be eventually. There's currently an injunction on that rule, and that we're hoping will eventually be resolved favorably. And I think also, as we're talking about the role of racism in these systems, it's also important to acknowledge that beyond those explicit exclusions, which of course have a significant impact, there's also the racism of the institutions who have the discretion to enact these policies day to day, and some very unfortunate history of agencies such as USDA, for example, in terms of who they view as their stakeholders or who they are providing the services to, even if on its face it's a racially neutral policy. The way that it's actually applied at the local level, at the agency level, has different impacts on different groups. And I think for me, one of the most straightforward examples of the stark racial disparities in our agricultural system, you really have to look no further than the government's own statistics and the government's own data. So according to the NAS, there's over 80% of farm workers who are Hispanic. And then according to the USDA, there's somewhere around, I think it's 3% of farm owners who are So how is it that the demographic that's so overrepresented in the people who have the expertise, have the knowledge, have the experience in doing this work are so underrepresented in ownership and actual profit from this work? I don't think anyone can look at those numbers objectively and think that race is not playing a role in that. And so I'm just really honored to be on this panel with these two titans, talking about how important it is to have a just agricultural system that really recognizes the reality that has always been the case, that the agricultural system has been built and continues to be built by people of color and immigrants. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aries. So both Juan and Aries have talked about some of the public laws and regulations in the United States and how those impact farm workers. And our next speaker, Abel, is going to talk about some private standards that center farm workers in developing standards to provide protections that they have created and that benefit from their input and feedback. So I will hand it over to you, Abel.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure listening to you both. My name is Abel Luna, an organizer with Migrant Justice. I grew up as a farm worker since 13, working on a dairy farm in the Black Bear region in New York, the Hudson Valley, working with onions and different crops. My father was a farm worker, and my grandfather was a farm worker during the H2a Program. And so it's a circle, and the work that I do is very personal to me. It's really important. That's why we're here today to share a little bit about the work that we do with Migrant Justice. How do we do it, and why do we do it in such way? All right, if you can go to the next slide. Awesome. So to give you a little bit of some context and some of the history, Migrant Justice is a grassroots organization, that was founded by migrant farm workers and continues to be led to this day by migrant farm workers in the dairy industry here in Vermont. And the main goal of the organization is to build the voice, the capacity, and the power of the migrant community, and also to engage allies to advance human rights and economic justice. If you can switch to the next slide. For those of you that might be familiar with our work in the history of migrant justice, this might just be a review. To those of you that haven't heard much about migrant justice, migrant justice really got its start in 2009 after the death of a young farm worker named Jose Obed Santos Cruz. He was 19 years old, a teenager from Chiapas, Mexico. And we always say that it's a death that could have been prevented if the right equipment, the right staffing had been in place. But that was really the spark to the conversation. Even amongst the migrant community that, we're here, we're sustaining some of the most famous brands of ice cream and cheese and dairy. And this is happening. And so, that was the beginning of the conversation among workers, that somebody died and what are we going to do to stop that from happening again? And it was then, from those first meetings, then that evolved into what we call community assemblies or community assemblies, which are basically, safe spaces that we hold in churches, universities, worker housing, and talk about, we share a meal, we eat together, and we talk about the issue, different issues that people are facing on the housing, things that people are facing on the farm, on the workplace, and good things, right? Through that process together, that has been a recipe for success of migrant justice. And through assemblies, early 2009-10, that's the process that led us to develop a 4-point maps or 4-point human rights agenda, which includes the freedom from discrimination, the access to transportation, access to mobility, freedom to mobility, the right to work and live with dignity, and access to healthcare. but through that process, right, it's workers defining what is it that workers need, what is it that workers want. Um, and yeah, we have been able to work on each specific point. For example, with the driver license campaign, now in Vermont, regardless of where you're from, what color you are, it doesn't matter. You have the right to drive, in Vermont, and that is a huge success. And also, in the community assemblies, a lot of the experience of the community was, hey, we're driving to the supermarket, we're driving to the doctor, or bringing my child to school, and I get stopped by the police, and I end up getting deported. My family separated, so it is a reality that people are facing in Vermont, and that's why freedom from discrimination was so important, and we worked and attacked that issue through the fair and impartial policing policy, which is one of the most successful policies in the country, that prohibits the collaboration between local police and border patrol. And also the right to work and live with dignity through the Meal with Dignity program that I'm gonna talk a little bit about. If you want to switch to the slide, thank you so much. Before diving into the Meal with Dignity program, it's important to understand a little bit about sort of the dairy industry here in Vermont. In the past few years, we've ran 2 surveys, surveying over 300 workers. And, some of the things that we found is that 80 to 90% of the dairy farms in Vermont, there are migrant workers. Whether it's a small family farm with 100 cows or less, or whether this is a 1,500, cow farm, doesn't matter the size. Migrant workers are pretty much working everywhere in small farms in Vermont or large farms. And sometimes, these farms are very isolated. They are very invisible, and they, create an opportunity for human rights abuses and violations. Some of the things that we have also learned through the surveys, and this is worker to worker surveying each other, and that is very sort of unique, and we can really learn what's happening on the farms. But some of the things that we've learned was that, there is a lot of old housing where workers are living, sometimes 2 to 3 people sharing a room. So a lot of overcrowded housing conditions. We talked about COVID and all of the restrictions that people had to take. It's not a reality on a dairy farm to take those preventive measures. Also, sometimes there's no running water, no heat. And there are the other issues, right, that are happening on the farm. High percentages of accidents with chemicals, for example. You're working with heavy machinery, hundreds of pound animals. So there are a lot of accidents that are happening, and we're also excluded from the access to healthcare. Which is really, to think about that, the people that are putting food on our tables not to have access to healthcare. That's something for us to think about a lot. And also, we talked about labor practices and how farm workers throughout decades have been excluded. Those lack of labor protections, workers are exposed to sexual harassment, to gender discrimination. They're exposed to unjust firings, retaliation, and including human trafficking. And that is the reality that we have learned that is happening here in the dairy farms. And I'm sure it's not just in Vermont, but I do want to say, I don't want to paint every single farm with the same brush. There are really good farms out there, farms that are treating workers right, providing good housing, with working conditions, good wages. And there are farms, right, that want to do the right thing. But when they try to do that right thing, like provide better housing or better working conditions, they can't because they face economic issues. And so if you want to switch it to the next slide, we're talking, we have to ask ourselves, why when farmers want to do provide a better housing, they can't. And really we have to look, we have to sort of understand the economic challenges that are happening there, and also we have to understand this problem at the root cause, right? And so we have to look at the industry, like the structure of the industry and the corporate supply chains, right? Which for example, in this slide, the pyramid, it shows, right, the corporate power at the very top. Basically it shows the corporate power where the milk goes from the farms to the co-op, and then from the co-op to the processors, and then from the processors it goes off to the brands. Basically, as you can see on the part of pyramid at the very few top, there is there's a consolidation, right, of power, but there's very few people at the top who are taking home all of the money. And there isn't much right left for the other people down on the pyramid. So with few buyers, with more powers, that they have control over how much they want to pay for the milk, so they can lower the prices. They can decide to do whatever they want. So we call that downward pressure. They create this downward pressure that eventually creates these labor conditions that we face on farms. And so another important thing to understand is that right now the prices of milk are similar to 1970s. So the more corporations are growing, the more power they have, and the more they can screw us all, screw farmers and screw workers. Really, that's what's happening. And so we have to take we have to understand the companies that are responsible for these conditions. They are creating these conditions, and they have to be held responsible and be part of the solution as well. That is how we see it. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. That Migrant Justice has created the Meal with Dignity program, and we call this bringing a new day to the dairy industry. And so, what is the program and how does it work? So basically, Migrant Justice signs legally binding agreements with corporations, and those corporations take responsibility for the conditions in their supply chain. Corporations commit to buy from farms in the program and pay them a premium and economic support for participating. When the farms receive this premium, they commit to comply with the code of conduct that was written directly by workers themselves. And this code of conduct creates the standards for wages, hours, rest, housing, the definition of dignity for our community. These standards are great, but they're useless if workers don't know how to use them, and workers don't know when to, who to call and all that. And so part of the program is that we have an education. We go to every single farm under the program and talk to workers about their rights, how to access the program, what they can do, and everything under the program. And that is a game changer, right? I was a farm worker myself, and I never saw somebody coming in to inspect the housing or to inspect the chemicals that we were using on the crop, right? And if nobody shows up, then you're not going to know your rights, and you're never going to speak up because you're afraid. And what you have here is an education program where workers sit together with farmers, and they're both running their rights, and also farmers their responsibilities, and that changes the whole thing, right? So I wanted to emphasize that, and also to make sure that so workers become empowered. They sort of become frontline monitors of their own workplace, and they're empowered to, when they see something, to say something, right? And that is really powerful. And to ensure that all of these things are happening, Migrant Justice created a third-party independent organization called the Meal with Dignity Standards Council that audits the farms to make sure that there is compliance with the code of conduct. And if there isn't compliance, then the farm can be suspended from the program, and then it loses its premium and the ability to sell to companies under the program. So it's really market consequences that are driving the change, and it's a whole package. It's not like one thing or another thing. It's a whole package that drives the change. If you don't mind going to the next slide, I'll be again soon, I promise. This is something not just happening in Vermont. This is it's also it's we are part of a global network called the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility model, which that's where the Meal with Dignity sort of sits under. And yeah, it's a it's a group of organizations, not just in the U.S. but also across the world. In Bangladesh, workers that are producing clothes for Nike or H&M are also implementing this model in their fabrics, where they're producing these clothes after a huge fire in Rwanda Plaza that killed many workers. Um, Workers in Bangladesh are implemented, workers in the construction industry in Minnesota, in Florida, which is the organization that sort of developed the leaders in this model. And so really we're part of a global network that where the program is being implemented. Um, yeah, and so that is a little bit about the Meal with Dignity program. And yeah, we're really excited to if you want to check our website, if you want to, learn a little bit more about our work, there's some information. Yeah, sure you have heard about Hannaford's, but we are trying to expand the program into the Hannaford's supply chain. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you for.
Thanks so much, Abel. I'm actually going to start with a question for you, since you were just talking about this, but I was wondering what the audits look like, and when the audits are happening, do workers still feel like they can't necessarily report violations because they know that there will be some repercussion to the employer, or do they feel comfortable reporting violations during the audits?
Yeah, well, I don't do the audits. That's the Meal with Dignity Standards Council that I do the audits. But basically, what happens in an audit, the MDAC, Meal with Dignity Standards Council, will show up, and they have an hour interview with the workers. It's a 1 hour, it's paid because it's workers' time. And they go over the code of conduct, and really try to identify, things that are not being complied with. Um, and this is and when there is something that isn't being complied with, for example, I don't know, maybe, wages, maybe the farmer isn't paying the minimum wage that they're supposed to. There is a process, right, where of collaboration between between all the parties to come up with a solution, that works for the worker. Um, and in the audit, yeah, I think it at the beginning when the program first came out, it was there, and everybody was starting to learn about the program, especially workers, and how to use the program. And we have seen the growth in workers' trust. Pretty much every week, we get a call or multiple calls. I don't know, but yeah, that is what we know. The workers, when we go to visit them, they share some of the things that changes they wanted to see, and that they have called the MDC, and that there's a plan in place, and so yeah, workers, are empowered to use the to talk to the Meal with Dignity Council, and talk about the different things that they want to see change during the audit. But,
Thank you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, and I just wanted to mention it's very different. For example, when I was mentioning, if nobody comes to your farm, and nobody is asking you, what things what things are good and what things aren't, versus having the Meal with Dignity Standards Council show up, people that also come to the education, so they're there with us in the education. You get to meet them, you get to talk to them, and you know that their job is to be there for you, to support you, to comply with. To comply with the code of conduct, that is really powerful.
Thanks so much. So I wanted to ask you all about the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. And I know, Iris, you all, Farmworker Justice has a great fact sheet on this. You were mentioning some of the fact sheets that you all developed. You all have a great fact sheet on this. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that bill proposes, and whether or not you think that essentially addresses a lot of the issues we've talked about tonight, or if you think there are some shortcomings.
Sure. So, well, first, it's mostly an immigration bill. It does have some labor components that I'll talk about with the H2a program, but it is fundamentally an immigration bill, which means, the labor exclusions that we talked about. There is a bill that was originally introduced last Congress called the Fairness for Farmworkers Act that now Vice President Harris introduced, and which has been incorporated to the U.S. Citizenship Act, which does address those exclusions. There's bills, on some of the heat stress issues and others. So obviously, those are outside the scope of the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. But what it does is it gives a path to legal status and eventual citizenship to farm workers, to undocumented farm workers, which, of course, as we've been talking about, immigration status is so central to many of the challenges and the issues that we see. And so that's really, it's not hyperbole to say that it's life-changing for folks, and it's not just for farm workers themselves, but for their families as well. So potentially millions of people could get relief from this bill. There's a second component which has to do with changes to the H2a program. So you can read our fact sheet for all the details. But some of the protections that are in the program regulations and not the statute. And so what we've seen is sort of a back and forth as administrations and political winds change in terms of what they're doing with the regulations. And so it's a bipartisan compromise. It passed in the House last month with 30 Republican votes, which is no small feat in our current political context. And so we are also, of course, there's concessions in there because it is a bipartisan bill. And so, of course, in an ideal world, waving our magic wand, we wouldn't have those concessions. But then, of course, it also wouldn't be a compromise that can garner that support. And I will also say that there's also some other immigration bills which we also have fact sheet on, including the U.S. Citizenship Act that I mentioned, and then the Essential Workers. Citizenship for Essential Workers Act that was recently introduced as well. And of course, there's also discussion about possibly the use of reconciliation for some immigration relief as well. So there's sort of a couple different possibilities right now.
That's great. Thank you. Juan, did you want to add something?
No, I'm thinking, I'm thinking about what Edith had said and what Abel said, and I'm delighted there's a possible path to citizenship. That's really important. And I'm delighted that Abel and his colleagues and the workers have found a way to make it in the economic interest of the employer to behave well. That's, in the end, that's the only thing that makes change is when it's in the employer's financial interest to behave. It doesn't seem like anything else really works. So that's a model that I'm delighted to learn about it, and it seems like one could go a long way with that. I hope.
Thank you. Abel, do you have any comments about the Farm Workforce Modernization Act?
Yeah, I can add a little bit. And I think this is more of a collective analysis among different groups of organizations and worker organizations. I think, to be very transparent, we oppose the Farm Worker Modernization Act, because we believe it will set a dangerous precedent for workers. It will continue to divide workers further, and ultimately it makes even more difficult life for farm workers across the country. And to sort of get a little more specific, is because it doesn't include, the right to organize for farm workers. It continues to exclude many workers from a legal status. And also you are required. So there's this long path to citizenship. In some cases you have to wait up to 8 years. And I mean, we are talking COVID era, not just that, but for always, farm workers have always been, excluded and screwed in many different ways, and they have to continue to endure these human rights abuses and conditions for 8 more years, and we don't think that that's fair. The other, and I think it's important to understand, is that it expands the H2a program. And basically, I think both Iris and Juan went a little bit into the H2a. Basically a visa program that you have to. It's attached to a specific farm, and if you leave the farm, you lose that status. And it expands on that without sort of any. Without any sort of teeth to make it stronger, right? And also, and because of that, workers are going to continue to suffer. So it expands on the H2a. It also makes mandatory, e-verify, which we don't think that's something that should be mandatory or even required, because then definitely we don't know where that information ends up and what can happen to that information. And yeah, I guess with which the H2a, to understand a little bit more why it expands it, but why is it dangerous? I know people that work on the H2a that because you are tied to a specific farm, people are afraid to speaking up. People are afraid of reporting human rights abuses or issues or things like that. And they don't. And if you do, then you sort of lose that status. You have to, and then all of a sudden, you are a target of Border Patrol, and you are a target for deportation if you sort of do that. And so, there are other things, but as a collective, different groups of workers, that is our analysis.
Thank you. So I'm gonna start with some of the questions that we've received from the audience. So one of the audience that we can't see. So one of the questions is about some legislation or pending legislation or proposed legislation in Maine and Colorado that would protect collective bargaining rights for farm workers. And the question is, and I'm going to expand on this a bit, just to pull in some other state laws. Do state-based solutions like these provide an effective substitute for federal protections? So even expanding it beyond collective bargaining, there are other examples of state laws and regulations that protect farm workers. And I'm curious what your all perspective is on whether or not those provide an effective substitute for federal protections.
I'm not sure how effective they are, and I'd love to hear from Iris and Abel about that. But as a strategy, it seems really, really important to try and make change at the state and local level rather than at the federal level, because advocates and people are much more able to influence the political process at a local level. So that's just really, really important to use that as a goal. And some protection is better than none. So if you can have state legislation that provides workers the same rights that other workers are entitled to at the federal level or more or beyond, that's all to the good.
Yeah, I agree. I think, when we have some of our national meetings, it's almost a running joke that whenever the California folks speak up, everybody else goes, "Oh, now you're just showing off," because there's a lot of state level protections, whether it's the Agricultural Labor Relations Board, heat stress bill at the state level. Not to say that they're perfect, right? But that goes, beyond what the federal level is providing. And as Professor Perea said, it's a very important model. There's a Colorado and Maine laws that were mentioned. There's also currently a bill in Oregon for overtime. In Washington, there was recently a farm worker rights bill that was passed in New York after many decades of work in that area. But of course, as we know, then that just means we have a patchwork, however good those laws may be. And then we also have a situation where we have still, even though it's a decreasing percentage, some migrant workers that are traveling in the migrant stream. And so you have this sort of surreal situation where you can have some rights, right, in one work site in one state and then move on to another state and not have that same protection.
Yeah, I forgot the question, but yeah, I think I remember it now. Um, yeah, that is it's a really good question, and I think a lot of the work that we do, the campaign work, we did it because at some point when we did surveys and we learned about the different issues that people were facing, and we ask ourselves, what is the best way to create a change? Go the legislative route or organize corporate campaigns, and there are already existing laws, federal level and at the local state level that protect workers, but they just are not efficient. They're not enough. They don't work. Um, I used to work on a farm. I'm a U.S. Worker. I was born and I work on a farm, and I file a complaint for wage theft that wasn't taken in the farm. It took almost a year to get results. Um, and so when we are faced with this question, what can we do? And maybe some rights are better than nothing. And I think we want everything, all the protection that we can get, and this is why the program, right, gives us those teeth. We have created our own Department of Labor, where workers call and they see results within minutes or hours or days of calling, and I think that's the beauty of the program, right? That we're not going to wait for the federal government or the state government to like, hey, you finally have the right to organize or the right to take a day off. And that's why we are creating an alternative that goes beyond it and above that. The other key part that I wanted to mention is implementation. And when it's awesome to see that some legislations have passed, but the implementation of it, there is a lot of work that goes into that, and to make sure that in every single farm, every worker actually seeing change. The government isn't equipped to do that. We have had conversations with the Department of different agencies in Vermont, and their answers is that they don't have the capacity to do that. And so we're left with this other question: what else can we build for workers? And that is how we build the program.
Yeah, and Abel brought up a point just briefly, and it's the issue of funding too. And I think that's another way in which sort of the embedded racism in terms of what do we give money to, right, in this country? So we give so much money to immigration enforcement and so little money comparatively to enforcement of the labor protections that are there. And I think that's, a pretty shorthand way of seeing where the priorities are.
Yeah, as we were talking about some of these state laws, I mean, I think one of the hardest things about it is whether or not they're being enforced. And that's sort of difficult to evaluate and to see like how rigorously they're being enforced. It's not as though the states provide a lot of data on that. And I know, Abel, when we talk to you all about what you think about, like, what are some great state laws, one of the perspectives from Migrant Justice was basically that, like, we like our system because we're in control and we have the ability to implement and enforce, and we don't have to wait for somebody else to do it. We don't have to wait for them to be funded to do it. We don't have to wait for them to make it an enforcement priority. We can just do it, which is such a tremendous value that you all have. I feel like side by side, having the state laws and regulations and the whatever federal protections that exist with alongside private governance programs like what you all have is a really great way to add a set of complementary protections and to fill some of the gaps. So another question that we had was about, for you, Abel, and whether the dairy worker abuses are as bad on organic farms as they are on conventional or non-organic farms. And also, could you name some specific brand products that consumers could boycott to join with you in solidarity, or alternatively put pressure on to join the Milk with Dignity program? And how can consumers support your work and safe labor standards?
Can you repeat the first part, please, of the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. Whether the worker abuses are as bad on organic farms as non-organic farms.
Yeah, that is it's a really good question. And yeah, it's a I used to think that because organic farms, there's an organic product and it's more care and all of that. Um, the conditions wouldn't be as bad or severe on conventional farms. But the reality is that and we have talked to workers a lot about this, and sometimes organic farms, there's a lot more work that is done by workers to make sure that cows are taken care of, and so there is a lot more work that goes into producing organic products. Sometimes it's more labor intensive. Um, so with that, eh, we're not actively boycotting any brands, but we are calling on Hannafords. We have been calling on Hannaford since October 3rd of 2019. Um, to join the Meal with Dignity program, and they have not responded. And the reason why Hannafords, is because they are a huge buyer of dairy in the Northeast. They have almost 200 stores, billions of dollars that they have, and so they definitely can. And they have the money to do it. They have the market power to drive that chain. And we're inviting them to be a champion of human rights. Yeah. So if you wanna, we're doing an action, a May Day action, where we're going to be doing a theater and a car rally in front of Hannaford's. And yeah, if you want to know more information, go to our website, migrantjustice.net, and you can find more about that. But yeah, on the organic farms, it is a lot more work for workers, more intensive. Sometimes there is no chemicals, but the work piece is a lot harder.
Thank you. We had another question about OSHA and whether or not you all see any innovative ways to take advantage of the fact that the OSHA Act, unlike some other federal laws, does broadly apply to farm workers in some way, even if there aren't standards that exist. And Aries, maybe you could talk about some of the challenges that presents, that there aren't actually standards, and OSHA relying on the general duty clause or not doing that at all.
Yeah, so I feel like I'm sometimes a Debbie Downer in some of these presentations, but there's actually a couple of OSHA exclusions. So the way it works with agricultural work is there's a list of sort of enumerated standards, and if if it doesn't apply to those, then it doesn't apply. There's also something called the small farms exemption, which is a rider that has been in the appropriations bill since the 1970s, which basically forbids OSHA from doing inspection or enforcement at small farms, even when there are injuries or even deaths. And so that's something that we've been advocating for many years. And then I think the person also mentioned the issue of pesticide labels. And that was something I didn't mention, but that's so important. And it brings up a broader issue about language access. So another one of these sort of battles that have been ongoing for a very long time is that we've been calling for bilingual pesticide, at the very least in Spanish and English, because the way that EPA frames it is the label is the law. But if you're not a native English speaker and you can't understand the label, then how is that supposed to be sufficient to protect you? And so again, these language access issues, not just Spanish, but also indigenous languages and other languages that workers speak, in just getting basic information about the products that are being applied, so that if there is exposure, they're able to at least have that basic information to be able to treat it, and to if they do decide to file a claim or what have you, that they have some of that information in hand. And so those are some of the other issues.
That's great. Thank you. Abel and Juan, do you want to comment on that at all?
I'd like to make a general comment,
Yeah.
which is that, especially in the immigration, can you hear me? Is it okay? In the immigration arena and others, legislation is always primarily meant to benefit corporate interests and employers and not workers. And so I share Abel's skepticism about the fair, I forget the title of it, but the statute we talked about before. And in general, it's because it's almost like statutes serve a kind of palliative function for uninformed majorities, basically. So everybody can feel better. Oh, we passed the statute. Oh, we did something, except then it languishes because of non-enforcement, or it wasn't the right stuff in the first place. For example, why is there an 8-year waiting period? Who benefits from that? And it's sure not migrant workers. It's sure not, people who want to become stakeholders. And that's always been in corporate interests. So the more I learn, the more I just become very, very skeptical of legislation, especially at the national level, but at the state level too, because it's easy. It's easy to pass rules that then go under enforced or not enforced at all. And historically, law basically just is like a face-saving mechanism that leaves the fundamentals essentially undisturbed. That may be heresy for a law professor to say, but I don't care. True. This is what I've learned, and so much better to ask the people most affected what would help, what would make a difference, and then go for that rather than, top down.
Well, if only that was how the laws were created in our country. It would be a much different place.
Right, but if we don't address that, then all we're going to do is keep replicating the same old story.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you divest, people of how do you create financial interests that correspond with responsible behavior? That's how do you pressure people to do the right thing, not just the expedient thing? I think that's just a very, very basic question. That's the only thing that will work. This has always been true when it comes to race discrimination. The only thing that works is to put pressure in the right places. And that doesn't even work a lot, but one makes more progress that way than otherwise.
Thanks, Juan.
So, sure.
We got another question about the Cedar Point nursery case. I just happened to be teaching a little bit about this case in my class yesterday. So I know that it might not be something that all of you are familiar with, but the question was whether or not you all have any commentary on the impact of it on union labor and agriculture in general.
To be
Wouldn't
honest,
it be
I'm
kind
not
of
familiar with the case.
What's that one? Oh, sorry.
No, I'm not too familiar with the case.
So there's a California regulation that's been in existence for 45 years that essentially allows union organizers to come onto farm property and talk to farm workers for 3 hours a day, 120 days a year. And there was a question about whether or not that constitutes takings under the Constitution, because it's not allowing the landowners the ability, I should say it's during non-working hours, and whether or not that constitutes a taking because it's not allowing the property owners to exclude the union organizers from their property, and whether or not they should be entitled to compensation from the government for that. So I think the arguments were, I want to say a couple of weeks ago in front of the Supreme Court. And there's been a whole host of questions about what that would mean for inspections and other types of activities that happen that people may not necessarily want on their property. So if any of you all have any comments, I'm sure the listeners would be happy to hear them, but we can also move to another question.
I would just say that as a theory, that sounds silly. Of course, it's not a taking. Of course, enforcement of rules is going to infringe on somebody's wishes for absolute freedom. And it just seems, it's a very cynical attempt to get a conservative Supreme Court to basically just diminish the scope of worker protections and enlarge the scope of corporate discretion. It's really a shame. That's silly. It's not a taking. It's just silly.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because some of the arguments were basically that that the situation for farm workers has changed so that they have more access to union organizers. But I think that all the stuff that you all talked about tonight, and Abel, what you've been talking about, I don't know that that's actually the reality of the situation. And many farm workers still obviously rely on their employers for housing. They rely on their employers for transportation. There are like very few public spaces between those areas where union organizers would have the ability to access them. So that was one of the interesting points that was raised, is that the situation for farm workers has changed, which I don't know that that's necessarily accurate. So one other question that we got related to the Milk with Dignity program is whether or not you all have ideas about how to replicate a worker-driven social responsibility model like Milk with Dignity, or like the Fair Food program that the Coalition of Immokalee Workers have created, in a situation where there isn't a large profitable centralized buyer, and whether you think that could work for smaller buyers as well.
That is a really good question. That's a good question. I think one of the key one of the key sort of things that make the program work is the market consequences, and how, for example, corporations are able to use that market power and pull that they have to tell farmers, hey, you don't do this, you're out of the program, you're losing money. And these times, this age, no one wants to be losing money. And so I think, yeah, that is something that that is why, for example, large corporations are able to do that, right? Because they're able to use that market power that they have. I think with like smaller, for example, on a smaller scale, that might not be present, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, I think there is a way to make it happen, even though there isn't that market power, but it's hard to imagine something like that, at a small scale, where you sort of, want the buyer to be, to be taking responsibility, and sometimes that means, paying a lot of money, right? And sort of that is sort of important. I think so. Yeah.
So as a last sort of big picture question for you all, if you had a magic wand that you could wave, what type of law would you enact, or what type of program would you enact, or what type of sort of public-private program would you enact? Or would you totally redo the Constitution, or the whole world is your oyster?
Ideally, I mean, I think working with the model and sort of, being there and sort of learning and knowing that it works, and it works for workers because it's proven to work. Ideally, we would like to see the model expand to the dairy industry, not just in Vermont, but across the U.S. And so that's something that I'm really hopeful for, and excited for.
Abel, can I ask you a follow-up to that? What do you think the sort of biggest hindrances are to that? and to basically like scaling up the program so that it would be all over the country?
That's a really good question. I think there is a danger, right? So the WSR, worker driven social responsibility, versus CSR, the corporate social responsibility. Um, you know, corporations in the past few years, because we are coming up, workers are coming up with their own programs that work and that put the responsibility on supply chains. But we have seen these brands and corporations come up with their own sort of internal programs, their own CSR, corporate social responsibility, develop code of conducts that really do nothing for workers, and end up sort of making things worse. And so I think that's one of the biggest obstacles, right? That challenge where, as you as a consumer, if you're buying from Hannaford, and Hannaford has put out this amazing media thing where they're respecting human rights, and they have done so, right? Like, we continue to pressure them and ramp up the campaign, and they have been, putting out that they're giving almost $500,000 to farmers to support farmers in the Northeast because of COVID. What about farm workers? And what about joining the program? Rather than just giving out cash, some pocket cash for Hannafords. So I think, that danger that, companies developing their own CSRs, that it's an imminent danger, but at the same time, the consumers have a lot of power to vote with their dollars, and to make sure that corporations are listening, and I think that is something that we have been able to use really well with Ben and Jerry's. Ben and Jerry didn't just sign happily. We took 3-year campaign, and a lot of that was the public narrative that they were doing good things, that workers were treated right, and everybody was happy, the farmers, the cows, and workers. And it was very different. And I think sort of that the narrative, and also the CSR programs that come out to try to dodge joining a program that really makes companies responsible for human rights abuses. And that's something that they don't want to do.
It seems to me that publicity would really help. Like, I would love to learn, more about what Abel and his group are doing, but also if everybody knew, I think more people would support it. And so it's great. This webinar is great because it gets the word out. But beyond that, because really the power lies in purchasing power. And so the more people who are willing to support worker rights, and there are a lot, I think, who may just not know, what the options are, may not know what a difference it can make. So that's a huge thing. And I would just offer one other thing. It ought to be easy to vote, because the easier it is to vote, the easier progressive change will be. And in a democracy, there's no good reason for it to be hard to vote. It ought to be really easy, including path to citizenship, in my opinion. So another thing to think about is that we spoke before about change at the state and local level. States can allow, even if you're not a citizen, there was a time in our history when states allowed people who weren't citizens to vote, for limited purposes, for some things, but maybe not for others. And I wonder if that could be a strategy with respect to labor conditions for farm workers, to enable everybody to vote. But you would have to have a receptive state, receptive legislature, basically, to make that happen. Anyway, just a thought. But the easier it is to vote, the easier it will be for more people to support progressive change, as slow and cumbersome and off the mark as that may be.
Thanks, Juan. Iris, do you have any parting thoughts with your magic wand to
With
share?
my magic wand, I mean, might as well just get rid of white supremacy and racism and have no, I mean, of course, right? That's the ideal. But to Professor Perea's point about voting, and also the point about publicity, I think the narrative is really important, and the visibility of farm workers, and just making people understand who are the people who feed them, and what their conditions are. And, you know, we often talk about laws and we talk about institutions as if they're sort of these nameless things, and ultimately they're made of people, right? And so the viewpoints of those people in terms of like the worth of these workers is ultimately what's creating that. And so obviously we need to start there. Yeah.
Well, I can't thank you all enough for such a great panel. It was so informative, and thanks to all of you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with all of us. It's certainly given us a lot to be thinking about. And we have a lot of thank yous that are coming in from the audience as well. Thanks to all of you who viewed the webinar. Please check out everyone's websites. Please check out Professor Perea's books. You have lots of resources to take away from this evening. And happy Earth Day to everyone. Thanks so much.
Everyone. Thank you, Elise and Juan.
Thank you, Abel. Thank you, Laurie, for bringing us together.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really great.